looking to see if there's, if I can see into the firefinch nest. Thanks for clicking on the video. I got a suggestion to make a video about finch compatibility. What an excellent topic. And a really hard one. So I think this video is both going to be long and really short. So the one true thing that I can say about finch compatibility is that I cannot make my birds get along. I have not figured out how to do it. I sometimes speak sternly to them. It does not seem to make much of an impression. So, I think it's fair to say, though, that I have put a ton of effort into trying to encourage my birds to get along, and that might be interesting to hear about. So, that's going to be the rest of the video. I cannot say that anything specific works, but in combination, I think they seem to work. Okay. So here are parameters of my aviary to start with. It's 12 foot wide, 16 feet long, 10 feet high at the apex. And I have 11 birds in here. All of the birds are selected from species that are thought to be or known to be passive, or good in a mixed aviary. So I have gold-breasted waxbill. I have red-billed firefinch. I have tri-colored parrotfit. Ah, that's the mister. Let me get out of here. Hang on. That's pretty funny. Is there such a thing as a blooper reel for bird keeping? Okay. Now, hang on one second. I gotta move these mealworms. Where can I move them? I'm gonna put them over here. Oh, I don't want to step in the stream in my socks. It's all problematic. Okay, here you go, guys. There's your bugs. Otherwise, all you're going to hear is Scarlett ratting me out for making her nervous about getting her bugs. What was I doing? Oh yeah, tricolored parrotfinch, and I have gray-headed oliveback, and chestnut-breasted mannequin. I have one male. That's Tristan. I was just talking about you. He's happy. Tristan's happy. He's good in the group, and he's good being solitary, so it's all good. There she is. I moved it. Oh, honey. Well, you can get some other ones. There's another dish there. Look at that. So, two things right away. Two lessons about the aviary that I've kind of touched on. One is space. There's kind of this threshold, right? There's pairing, like two birds. You wouldn't want to keep finches by themselves. I think generally everybody agrees that that's not a good thing. It's not kind to them. So you might have a pair of finches. You might have a family group or a small group. Or you might have more than that, a lot. And I think I've seen videos where they're huge aviaries just chock full of birds, And to a certain extent, I think there's this overwhelming factor where they may get along just because it's just, you know, constant motion and visual noise and it's just craziness. But for me, that's not what I am looking for in terms of the environment that I want to create for my birds or the environment I want to sit in. I don't want to be just birds everywhere. So I'm somewhere in between. But generally, I think more space per bird is better. And then the kind of space matters that you create as well. Second thing is trying to select species that are more on the passive side can be helpful. Even so, these birds squabble. And there's a cyclical cycle to their compatibility that is related to the molt and breeding. So molting is on, you know, one half of the year, and then breeding mindset is on the other half of the year. And then in between those two periods, if you think of them as seasons, are the most compatible mindsets that the birds are in, I think. It's more of a flocking mindset. They're not actively getting ready to breed or searching for nests. Molting is pretty passive time, but the birds aren't feeling very well. They're kind of morose and grumpy, and there can be a little bit of bickering there, but they don't have a whole lot of energy to put toward chasing and feather plucking and fighting. The breeding season is a whole different story. And the dilemma with keeping finches is if you give them a good diet and you give them a nice environment and you manage the lighting in terms of the duration, which is just keeping the lights on for your daily life is enough light to trigger breeding. And some birds like to roost in a nest. They like to sleep in a nest. And so you give them a nest so they're comfortable sleeping well. Or even if you don't give them a nest. So like it or not, the breeding mindset is hard not to have to deal with finches. So there's this cycle of compatibility that's happening. And because you have to deal with that, then the question is, well, to what degree is that going to be a problem? And you have to decide what you can live with, what you're comfortable with. And you obviously want the birds to be happy and healthy and not physically harmed and not emotionally traumatized by living with whoever they're living with. So I would say there's a scale of compatibility that might be helpful to think about. So let me describe that. On one end of the spectrum would be what I was just watching, the mannequins. You envision, you know, two birds perched right next to each other, all cuddly and allopreening and feeding together and, you know, all piled together in a nest, roosting at night. And the quintessential finch you kind of envision, if that's your picture of compatible, would be Society or Bengalese finches. That's pretty characteristic of their demeanor. And then sort of the next step up from that would be, I guess I would say indifference. So an example there, if you keep finches and also button quail, they share the space, they don't interact much, they don't bug each other, they're kind of indifferent to each other. The next step up from there might be finches or finch species that flock together or loosely flock together. So some of the waxbills, for example, they'll bathe together, they'll eat on the ground together as a loose flock. They don't really alloprene across species, but they don't really bug each other too much either. So that's another step up in compatible. Then there are pair bonds. And depending on the species, sometimes the pair is very sort of kind and gentle with each other. They don't bicker, they don't get pissy with one another. They're just nicely compatible. Then another step up from that might be, for example, the parrot finches. So the parrot finches bicker. They have little arguments, they bicker. So I should be videotaping. There's always something to show you in the aviary, always. And then it distracts me. I forget what I was doing. Okay, so then there's this, layer of bickering, and the parrot finches have this sort of the males chase the females. The breeding is actually fairly aggressive, I would say. And so it's, even though they're compatible, even though they're raising the babies together, they're a pair, but it's an uneasy alliance, sort of. Then the next layer up from that is where you start to get into what people think of as sort of aggressive behavior, where birds are intolerant of other birds, and that can fall into a lot of categories. Males intolerant of males of other species, and female. Or one species intolerant of another closely related species, like the grenadiers. Or one species intolerant and won't share space with birds with particular markings, like red on their face, for example. Or a species that are not tolerant of any other of their own species in the same space, including parents and adult babies. And then what influences sort of the severity of that level is how they act on it. The goldbreasts, for example, are starting to nest, and they have a defensible space of about 3 feet around the nest. And that's where they consider like the no-fly zone for the other birds. All of the other birds, doesn't matter who they are. And so the way that they're feisty little guys. They're the smallest birds that I have in the aviary, and they must be right up there with the smallest finches that you keep at all. And so what they do is they kind of dive bomb at the other birds, and they yell at them. And if they could get a hold of the other birds, which is rare, but if they can, they'll pull on a feather. But I've never seen them pull out a feather. And I've only once seen them actually get close enough to actually touch a bird and try. So that's not a catastrophic interrelationship. The other birds don't take them very seriously, but because they're being pestered, they move out of the space, and then the goldbreasts are happy and relaxed, and there's sort of this equilibrium that they come to. The parrot finches are kind of a step up from that, in that they bicker. And I'll show you some examples of bicker. They chase each other, and they, when the bird that's being chased gets tired of it, they stop moving, and then they have this little bicker. They're not biting at each other. They're not doing anything other than that, but they're, I don't have a better word for it, they're bickering. The male parrot finches can be pretty ruthless to the females when they're going through the breeding and copulation cycle. So they chase for real, and they can grab the nape and pull feathers, and so for me, is bordering on an uncomfortable situation to be aware that's happening, but that's their natural mode of operation. So who am I to say? And then the next step above that might be, the aggression or incompatibility. I won't even say incompatibility. Some of the birds are compatible, but they're acting out either stresses or it's just part of the dynamic of their interaction to do things that are uncomfortable for us, like plucking feathers. They'll pull feathers for nesting material. They'll pull feathers off of their nestlings, their babies. They'll pull feathers off of their partner. They'll even pull their own feathers. So how much of that is natural? Some of it is, I think. And some of it is a natural behavior that's become kind of neurotic because of other circumstances. So that, you know, that's another degree of sort of this incompatible energy that's happening. It doesn't have to be a big surprise when you add birds to your family, where they're likely to go with their temperament and compatibility. So before you get birds of any type, do research on what their temperament is like and how do you keep them and what makes them happy. There are great websites. Just do a search on finch keeping or finch aviary or, you know, whatever it is. There are channels on YouTube that talk about keeping finches. There are great clubs and groups on the social media, and you can get lots of information from people who have kept these birds before. Birds have been kept for a long time, and there's a lot of good information out there. I will show you the books that I refer to frequently when I'm trying to understand the birds and the bird behavior and compatibility, and when I selected the birds that I have selected that I want to focus on. Here are some of the things that I have tried to encourage my birds to get along. So the first thing, I've given them as much space as I can. And I selected birds that are from species that are known to be good in mixed aviaries. And generally considered on the passive side. And that's pretty well documented and easy to research online. So that is the starting point. And then everything else I'm doing is environmental. One thing you'll notice is I have a lot of dense cover. Well, do I say a lot? I have, reducing sight lines can help with compatibility. So having places where a lot of the incompatible behaviors are triggered visually, and so if you can reduce the ability of the birds to see each other, then you can mitigate some of that. So, for example, the divided perches, where when they perch, there's a visual barrier. So somebody could be on the perch right here, but they can't, it doesn't trigger them to be worried about it. Of course, they're all sitting on top of the dividers. I will take that to mean they all get along. Then I have the dense foliage. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of these pretty dense trees, plus 5, 6 littler ones. And that is another place where the birds can go, get out of sight, and they can also rest. If they're being chased, they can head for the hills, they can head for the dense foliage, and then they kind of dissipate the energy. So that's one thing that I have tried to do. The second thing is I've tried to select species that have different they're comfortable in different parts of the aviary. So the wax-bills spend a lot of time on the ground, and they're foraging and exploring and hopping around. So they're kind of down in this space. It doesn't mean that they're not perching and they're not up there. They are, but they're the energy can kind of dissipate because they're happy to come down here. And then the parrot finches are super curious. They're always exploring. So the aviary itself is like an enrichment activity for them, just period. They're in every corner, and they're, I think on my Facebook, I posted a picture twice when they were in the cages inside. I found a screw in the bottom of the cage, one in the water dish. So they're taking apart the cage. So they're always into something. They're not as into the other birds. They're just kind of, oh, what's that all about? And they're picking at things all the time. So that's kind of their MO. The mannequins like to be high up in the canopy, if you will. And then Tristan is kind of a solitary kind of a guy. He gets along with everybody. Olive-backs are known for being problematic in terms of pairing up. And you have to introduce them to members of their own species carefully. But he's been lovely with the other birds. He's, in the winter, he was living with both the goldbreast for a while and with the parrot finches, and totally amenable. In fact, the female parrot finch was elapreening him, and he was okay with it. So that was nice. All right, so that's another thing I have tried to do is create lots of different little kind of sub-environments that the birds are more or less interested in, so they can kind of go their own way. And then the open perching is separated. So there's a manzanita perch here, and then there's a bunch of perches on the other side. So the big flight lines where they go from an open perch to an open perch create separation. I have multiple feeding stations just to make sure that no one is protecting a particular station, and that creates a point of conflict between the birds. Then the final thing is complicated to describe. So I'm going to think for a second how to say what I want to say. I manipulate where they are going to nest to the best of my ability. It's a little easier to do in a cage, but not entirely. So one of the ways you do that is you place one nest box over in this corner and one nest box over in that corner. That's a simple way to do that. And then if you create visual barriers with foliage or towels or whatever, fake plants, whatever you do, then that creates these little special areas that they can be. And that can help. In an aviary, I do the same exact thing, but what I do is either knowing the species or knowing these specific birds, which I've now had for a while, I know the kind of areas they're attracted to. I can't force them to nest anywhere, but for example, the parrot finches want to nest in a cavity that has good visibility. They don't want to be in dense cover. They want to be in a cavity. So knowing that, I can place the nest boxes and in areas that they're likely to be comfortable, and then they'll be attracted to the nest box, and then that's where they nest. So a classic example of that is the fire finches, who wanted to nest in a little depression in the rock with a branch over the top, because it's similar to what they like to have a dome nest with a side entrance. So it kind of seemed familiar to them, and that's where they decided to start nesting. But if they nested there, they were going to defend this whole space, which is where the food is, and it was kind of in the middle of everything. So I manipulated them into nesting in the corner, way back there. And the only thing that they defend now is the naked branches, the tan-colored manzanita branches. So as long as the other birds don't stay or hang around on those, no problem. So I don't end up with any kind of incompatibility there. The goldbreast, another example. Moved them up high because I know they like to perch on, not perches, they actually like to be on ledges. And so by creating those rectangular ledges and getting them up high, I routed them to a kind of a unused place. Now they do, their defensible space includes the top of the manzanita. So some of the branches, if the birds get too close, they chase them off those branches on the manzanita. So then what could I do? Well, I could drop the manzanita down out of that range and see if that helps. The mannequins, I've done something a little bit different. I think I mentioned in a previous video, they were trying to nest in the top of the tree that's by the warming area, and their defensible space was this entire half of the aviary, including the open perching, and they were forcing the rest of the birds over to this side, which was creating congestion and problems because there's a parrot finch nest right there, and then the goldbreast. So what I did with them, I built the cage, and I took their nest, I recreated the top of a tree inside the cage, and I took a nest box and moved it in there, and I've put them in the cage. They're locked in for the moment until they kind of gave up on the thinking about the top of that tree, and they have now built their, I don't know if you can hear them. They've now built their nest inside the cage, and my plan is, once they lay eggs, give them a couple days just to get into incubating, I'm going to open the door to the cage so they can come out and explore and burn energy and eat and do, take baths and whatnot. And I'm hoping that the only space they will defend is the inside of the cage and not out here. So we'll see how that goes. That's another thing I'm trying to do. And I'll show you something that the parrot finches were trying to nest inside the reed ball where one of the feeders were, and they're trying to defend the space around the two feeders. Well, I don't want that, so I am in the process of making that less attractive to them and rerouting them somewhere else where they would be more out of the way and more comfortable and wouldn't be so inclined to, chase the birds out of the area. So that is a whole collection of manipulation that I have to do to kind of keep the peace. If I kept all male finches, I probably wouldn't have to worry about it with these species, or all females. If I had one pair in here, I probably wouldn't have to worry about it. So after the breeding cycle is complete here, then I will not, I'll take all the nesting, nest boxes, anything that's triggering the nesting, I'll take out of the aviary, and then I should have peace all the way through until sort of this time next spring, she says. So, I guess the last thing that I'll say is, there are exceptions to the rule. Oh my gosh. If people were so inclined to comment on this video, I bet I would get 1,000 stories of finches that are supposed to be passive and they are tyrants. And, 3 males from different species all raising the same clutch together. Or birds that are known for being aggressive and they're just the kindest, gentlest birds in the group. So birds are individual. One of the things that you can do if you have the option or opportunity is let the birds pick who they want to be with. Okay, so one last idea. And I did this with the mannequins. So I got 4 mannequins. They're a little bit hard to tell males from females, but the intention was to get 2 male and 2 female, to have 2 pair. rather than me decide who should pair up, what I did was I put all 4 birds in a double wide cage that had a partition, and I just watched them and watched who seemed to hang out together, who was allopreening, who was having issues with each other. And as I started to get a feeling for that, by the way, they were ringed, so I knew who was who, banded. Then I put the divider in, and I put these 2 together and these 2 together. And I just watched to see how they got on, and was this one really pining for a bird over here? And I often, when I do that, I often have the perches side by side on either side. So does this one sit here and this one sits here? They're trying to stay together. And I thought, okay, I think I've got this right, but let me just try and see what happens if I swap these 2 birds. And so I did. Nope, they did not. They were not happy. They didn't like that. Okay, swapped them back. Yep, definitely. So I kind of let them pick who they wanted to pair up with. So in the aviary now, I have just the 1 pair. The other pair is still in the basement, and they get the whole cage all to themselves. And that can sometimes help with relationship or compatibility as well. So that was a long explanation to say that you cannot force your birds to get along, I don't think. I'm not sure you can teach them to get along, maybe you can, but you can encourage them to get along. Be prepared that if they don't, this is an unnatural environment. And we're forcing them into close proximity, and we're constraining their movement and making them deal with other birds they might just soon not deal with. So be prepared that you may have to separate them, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently. And that's a big commitment to make when you bring birds into the family, for sure. So, hope that helps. Thank you for clicking on the video. I'm not going to move right now because they're eating their mealworms. Getting ready to feed the babies. Did you notice I don't know what order I'm going to piece these clips together, but if I forget to mention it, watch in the clip when I'm sitting over there, watch behind me. You'll see the firefinch parents going back and forth to the nest feeding the babies.